Alors maintenant, c'est mon plaisir de vous présenter un homme de cœur qui est un champion pour les droits de la personne et aussi pour ce musée. Our next speaker is well known to everyone here in the room. Stuart Murray served as the inaugural Director and CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, as you know. He oversaw the all-important steps from construction to functioning as an operational national museum. And his passion for human rights learning and dialogue led him to the creation of the City of Human Rights Education Initiative. And if we're here tonight, it's because of Stuart. A while back, he approached the Friends of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights with the idea of bringing the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney to Winnipeg in connection with his exhibit, Mandela Struggle for Freedom. So it seems only fitting that the man who brought this bright idea forward should also have the honor of introducing our guests. So c'est grâce à l'idée de Stuart si nous sommes réunis ce soir. Nous lui en remercions. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome now Stuart Murray.
Mr. Bagu, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Well, it is a great honor for me to introduce what is going to be our host and our guest speaker. I would tell you that both Brian and I don't know if I should call him the Honorable Peter, had great involvement early days with this museum. I know that when the Juno Awards were here in 2006, that we needed a star pin. And the star pin was designed, Kim Jasper, thank you very much. The call went out because Ben was going to be on the red carpet, and of course Gail called Brian and said, we need that star pin on Ben to make sure the world sees what we're doing. One call made, Ben was wearing the star, it was amazing. Well done. So now Peter, I'm going to introduce them both separately. Let me start with Peter, and of course it's well documented of how Peter was discovered. Everybody knows that he was announcing flights out of Churchill, and that led to, frankly, a very interesting journey that made Peter one of the most thoughtful, capable, and intelligent journalists of his time. And I mean that sincerely, but I also mean that Peter's one of these guys who, when I listen to him speak at an event, he has this ability to have a little self-deprecation humor. And he was talking about the fact that after he was discovered and had this great voice to go on television, thought he'd try his hand a little bit at the radio game. So it was a bit of a radio DJ. So there's DJ Mansbridge at the same day that Simon and Garfunkel launched Bridge Over Troubled Water. Now, to put it in perspective, that was a bit of a longer, normal song. And so DJ Mansbridge, with authority, announced, well, this will never be a hit. 25 million sellers late on. Anyway, in all sincerity, we're delighted that Peter is with us this evening. What a career, what a legacy. You know, you think about it, every night we invited him into our bedrooms, our living rooms, to watch from a Canadian perspective his view of the world as he delivered the news. And sometimes it was royal weddings, sometimes it was tragedies, sometimes it was amazing things like election evenings, or some things important to all of us as Canadians, like Vimy Ridge. Those are the kinds of things that Peter brought to us in a very Canadian way. And perhaps none more prolific than two amazing Canadians in a room together, that being Peter Mansbridge and Gord Downie. That was an interview, I think, one for the ages. So we're delighted that this Canadian, this Manitoban, this guy who on Instagram wears a whiteout jersey saying, "Go Jets, go," is here with us tonight. Peter, welcome. So I have to share with you that I first met Brian Mulroney in 1983. 1983 was the year of the leadership for the Progressive Conservative Party. It was taking place in Ottawa. And those leadership conventions, they can be some pretty tough drag-em-out stuff. And so it was on this day during the convention that Brian walked into a hotel lobby in the convention center that was holding this leadership convention. He saw 5 people at the elevator. They just pressed the door, they were waiting to go up to their rooms. Of course, Brian wants to get everybody with him. So he yelled out across the room, "Hey fellas, I hope you're with me." Well, there's a bit of an awkward silence. And one of them said, "You know, Mr. Mulroney, we don't like your policies very much. We don't like the fact that you were in business, and we don't like the fact that you've never been elected. The doors open, they get on, they close, and up they go." So those of us that are trying to track these delegates to see how they're going to vote, we looked at the boss and said, "Jesus, what are we going to put down for this?" And without missing a beat, he said, "Mark him down as undecided." Well, as you know, and by the way, that 1983 convention was the first convention that Peter Mansbridge was the anchor for, so there's a reason that they're here tonight. But history showed that he won that convention, and he also won back-to-back majority governments in 1984 and 1988. And for those of us that are progressive conservatives, we have to go all the way back to 1891 when Sir John A. did the same thing. That, sir, was an incredible achievement. Now, you may know that recently a book has come out by Fen Osler Hampson. He's authored a book called Master of Persuasion, Brian Mulroney's Global Legacy. And in that book, a prolific and highly regarded U.S. politician, James Baker III, wrote, and I quote, "Under Brian Mulroney's leadership, Canada punched well above its weight at the world stage." Well, when you examine the fact that it was through Mulroney's leadership that Canada's role in providing food for the Ethiopian famine, the Gulf War, peacekeeping, the Acid Rain Accord. Now, this one, just a little quick pause here. You got to know that in 2006, there's a lot of people on the left side of the political spectrum that had to swallow pretty hard to realize that Brian Mulroney was the greenest prime minister in Canada. Free trade, that's a big discussion. And of course, why we're here tonight, ending apartheid in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I tell you this, these are not actions of a political leader that worries about the next election. These are the actions of a political leader that worries about the next generation. Brian promoted Canada, its values. He talked about our hopes and our dreams, big dreams. He brought forward a vision of national unity, of building on something that would allow all Canadians from walks of life, to stand before the Canadian flag and say, "This is my home. This is our home." Brian is a world leader, visionary, and transformative in every sense of the word. He's a businessman, he's a father, a husband, a grandfather, as we saw on TV, a great-grandfather, and most importantly, perhaps, this evening and after this evening, a very good friend of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. The 18th Prime Minister of Canada, ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney. Please, gentlemen, take the stage.
Thank you.
Did you want to say something first?
Pardon?
Did you want to, before we get into it, you wanted to say a few things?
Yeah, I just want, before we we start, it was 35 years ago Monday that I was elected leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, and then and you know, people want to be prime minister when they get elected leader, and so did I, but there's something else I wanted even more. I wanted ultimately to be an anchor on the CBC. And I wanted to interrogate the hell out of Peter Mansbridge. So I'll be hosting tonight, and Peter will be answering the questions. I just, you know what? I want to thank Stuart Murray for having me here tonight, my old friend Stuart. Stuart is the only advanced man in history that I'm aware of whom Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, said to Margaret Thatcher, "Margaret, you better pay attention to Brian's advanced man." And Margaret said, "Why would I do that?" He said, "Because he's the only advanced man I've ever seen who wears a tuxedo and running shoes." Well, I want to just comment briefly on the fact that I see Gary Dewar here, who was a remarkable ambassador for Canada down in Washington, and I know of his very, very good work. And I ran into my old friend, I say that advisedly, Lloyd Axworthy, on the way in. But now that all of the battles have ceased, I can tell you that he was a remarkably effective foreign minister and did some great things. In fact, the senior senator from Vermont once asked me, and I said yes, if I would second Lloyd's nomination for the Nobel Prize. And we did. We did it. I don't think he won, but we were supporting him. And I want to also, and I know that this would be appropriate, I want to thank and I knew Izzy Asper very well. He was a great man. And he was proud of a lot of things in life, but he's watching down from on high. And he is so proud of what I'm sure, of what Gail and David and the family have done to bring this jewel of an achievement to Manitoba. So Charlie Mayer is here, and which reminds me of how great he was as Minister of Agriculture and how much good work he did for Manitoba. But I want to tell you in particular that as I turn to Peter, you know, what I've learned is that as years go by, and I'm not getting any younger, but as years go by, you know, we all expect our children, you know, to nudge us gently out of the spotlight, you know. That's fair ball. That's okay. But when your grandchildren blow you to smithereens, it's time to throw in the bloody towel.
It's amazing when you think of it that the grandkids already at their young age have been seen by more people on this planet than the rest of us put together over whatever number of years. Just before I start with the questions and the conversation, I want to also thank those who are responsible for asking me to be here tonight. One, I'm a huge fan of this museum and have spoken of it fondly in different parts of the country. I've brought the program here when I used to have a job, and we did the national from here one night just last year, and I've had, you know, I find this so impressive as a museum. It's very moving and inspiring to walk through the exhibits here. I'm also grateful to be here because, like the former Prime Minister, Izzy Asper was a friend of mine, and I owe him a lot from my early days here in Winnipeg in the late 60s and early 70s, at a time when he was the lone Liberal member from Winnipeg in the provincial legislature, you know, warming the seat up for Lloyd to be the lone member from Winnipeg a little later. You know, Izzy was a great friend, and so have his children in Gail and Len, and David being the same way to me. And finally, I'm glad to be here to be able to sit across from this man. We've known each other for almost 40 years in that relationship that at times can be, you know, can be quite tense between a journalist and a public figure. I think we've always had a degree of respect for each other, even at times when things have been, you know, difficult in terms of the stories that have been covered. But the one thing, you know, I will say, and was so happy to be here for tonight, is this issue, this story, this involvement by this man is something that all Canadians can be so extremely proud of, and should not forget exactly how it happened. And that's what we're going to try and do in this next half hour or so, is try and go through some of the moments. You know, you mentioned that it's, what, 24 years ago now since you won that first majority government in 1984. And almost immediately, when you sat down with your cabinet and your government officials, you made it clear to them that for you, the number one issue for Canada on the international stage in foreign policy was going to be to try and find a way to bring an end to apartheid in South Africa and freedom for Nelson Mandela. And what I want to know is, when you walked into those rooms to make that statement, of all the things that were out there, and there were lots on the international stage that you could have picked and said, this is what I want to achieve, you picked that one. Why?
Well, Peter, it went back to my very young days when I was a member of the Progressive Conservative Student Federation. And here we were in Ottawa at a convention in March of 1961, I think. And Prime Minister Diefenbaker, who was the leader of the party, for whom I had gone to Ottawa to vote as leader when I was 16 or 17 in 1956. And I voted for Diefenbaker and supported him, although I didn't know him, was because of his reputation for the defense of human rights. He always fought for the little man across Western Canada. And that stuck with me. My father was an electrician who had to hold down 2 jobs to look after a family of 6 children. And my mother had to take in boarders. So when Diefenbaker talked about these things, he wasn't, as Mademoiselle would say, il ne parlait pas dans l'oreille d'un sourd. You know, I knew what he was talking about. So I was attracted to him. Anyway, Dief wins, and he goes off to London. And he was instrumental in excluding South Africa from the Commonwealth, based on what the good words of the High Commissioner earlier tonight. And then life went on. Mandela was in jail, and I was both surprised and saddened to see that very little was done on his behalf. And all of a sudden, fate intervened, and in 1984, I was sworn in as Prime Minister of Canada. I'm not disparaging anybody by saying that, you know, I thought often of Mandela being alone in that jail cell and I couldn't see very much happening, on his behalf, either with the G7 or Canada or the United Nations. So I made the determination that my government would have this as a priority. And I went to Cabinet and I told them that this was going to be the highest priority of the Government of Canada in terms of foreign affairs, apart from our obligation, of course, to maintain the Canada-US relationship and so on. But that was it. In December of that year, Archbishop Tutu and Oliver Tambo, and I think Thabo Mbeki, came to see me in Ottawa. And I asked Tutu at the end of the meeting, I said, look, Canada's not a superpower. Do you think that, Mike, the campaign that I've launched here, very little effect so far. Do you think that this is something that where Canada can play an effective role? He said, Prime Minister, let me tell you, what South Africa needs, what Mandela needs, is a member of the G7, an industrialized, rich country like Canada, which is white, to take up the cudgels because everybody else is dropping them. There's so many things going on that Mandela is becoming a forgotten man. And so just to conclude, I spoke to Joe Clark about it, and who did a fantastic job, by the way, all the time he was foreign minister, particularly on this file. Joe did a wonderful job. And so the government, Peter, picked it up, and we started, and lo and behold, many years later, we managed to get there.
But you managed to get there, through a struggle, because it was a struggle. I mean, it's easy to listen to it now and say, man, it was automatic. Everybody should want to do this, to be involved in this, and surely it can be moved along quickly. But it was also a time when a lot of the world, a lot of the people you were going to have to convince, looked at Nelson Mandela as the High Commissioner pointed out earlier, as a terrorist, as a communist. He was in jail, he should be in jail. He should never get out of jail. So you go to that first G7 meeting after listening to Mbeki and Tambo and Desmond Tutu, which was 6 months or so later in Germany, 1985. Your first G7. You're sitting at the adult table all of a sudden. The big guys are sitting there, and you're looking across the table. There's Reagan, Thatcher, Kohl, Mitterrand. And for the most part, maybe Mitterrand a little softness there, but for the most part, dead behind the eyes on this issue. The rest of the table. They weren't interested.
Not a bit.
How did that impact you? Did you go, I'm never going to get this done?
Well, that crossed my mind. I'll tell you, Peter. In fact, after I decided that the only way we were going to be able to do this is for me to force it onto the agenda of the G7 and try and get it in the communiqué, and then on the Commonwealth, and then la francophonie, to use Canada's quote-unquote clout in these various things to try and get this done. Well, Margaret was against this from the beginning. She was the most vocal in her opposition. So when I pressed the case in Bonn, that in 1985, in May of 1985, Margaret came to see me after, and she said, and I loved her. She was a great leader and so on, but she had a blind spot on this issue. She came to see me and she said, Brian, look, you're kind of new here. Like, I'm going to help you out. The position you have to, she didn't say this, but what she meant was, the position you really have to adopt is mine. Like she told her cabinet every day. So she said, look, what you don't understand is that Mandela is a communist and a terrorist, and that's why he's there. And I said, well, Margaret, how do you know that? She said, well, everybody knows that. I said, have you been talking to him lately? She said, well, no, he's in jail. There's the problem. There's the problem. I'll bet you $1 to a donut that when he gets out of jail, you're going to find out that he's almost as conservative as you are. And Margaret said, I've never heard anything like this before. And I said, well, I tell you what, you're complaining that Mandela and the ANC, because it was the ANC that was being targeted then, the ANC is bad because it accepts money from Castro and Gaddafi and all of these other, as she said, crackpots around the world. I said, I'll tell you what, something. If I were in jail and I had asked you for money and help for my people to get me out and to get the ANC unbanned, and you wouldn't help me, but Castro and Gaddafi did, they would be my friends when I got out of jail, and you'd be my enemy when we got out. And so she said, well, there's no use talking to you. So that was my first encounter with her.
Shortly after that, later that year,
Yeah,
you go to Nassau,
that's right.
Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, where I assume Margaret Thatcher's still there, but, but you're also playing to a crowd that's much more sympathetic on this idea.
Yeah,
And you achieve, as a group, an initial goal, the Eminent Persons Group.
that's right. The Eminent Persons Group Margaret was opposed. And you know, as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in the Commonwealth, she had a lot of weight because there were the two big players in the Commonwealth are Canada and the United Kingdom, but mostly the United Kingdom. And so Margaret opposed this, but Rajiv Gandhi, Bob Hawke from Australia, who was terrific, and Mugabe at that time, who was sensible, sane at that time, and I were pressing for the creation of an Eminent Persons Group, which would be created on behalf of the Commonwealth, and we would send to South Africa and insist that the government in Pretoria meet with them and start the dialogue on behalf of Mandela. And so we put it together, and that began the very slow and awkward movement towards the ultimate result. Later, I think it was later that year, 85, 80, Her Majesty convened a meeting at Buckingham Palace, a dinner meeting, 5 of us and her. And she never said a word, but I want to tell you that you'd have to be pretty dumb not to figure out what her body language was, where she stood on this issue. She never really got involved in politics or said anything, but Margaret was really bellowing at the time, and Her Majesty made it very clear that this was not something that she wanted to hear, particularly in her house. So even Margaret was cowed by that. And we then moved on to the next steps, which were pretty tough.
The Eminent Persons Group, we tend to forget about now, but it played a real key role. There were 3 people on it, one of whom was a Canadian, Archbishop Ted Scott. They went to South Africa to interview a lot of the key players, including Nelson Mandela. Yeah. And very few people had talked to Nelson Mandela during the whole time of his imprisonment. And I can remember talking to Ted Scott, because I was in London at that time, that summer, and just listening to him talk about seeing this man, I think they met in his prison cell. But there's an interesting fact about that Canadian involvement on that group.
Yeah, we were in Nassau at the end of the thing and trying to put this together. And before Ted's name came up, Ted Scott, the Archbishop, I proposed to the group, to the heads of government, that Pierre Trudeau be appointed to this. And so Sonny Ramphel, who was the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and I called Pierre in Montreal, and he felt he couldn't accept at that time. But Ted Scott came in and did a marvelous job. And in fact, I thought I wanted Trudeau there because as a former Prime Minister, they'd have to pay a lot of attention to him. But as it turned out, you know, the majesty of the ecumenical cloth being what it was, Ted Scott as an archbishop had a lot of clout, and the South Africans respected him and gave him a lot of time and a lot of attention.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is news. I don't think I've ever heard the Pierre Trudeau angle to this story before. I want to read you something, because the next big, you know, kind of critical meeting in all this, and really the one that led to the big breakthrough, was '87 at the United Nations. Yeah. The speeches that were made at that time, you chose to talk about South Africa and about the need for movement. And I'm going to read you 2 lines from a speech that Stephen Lewis gave, who was our ambassador to the UN at that time, an appointment that surprised a lot of progressive conservatives when you made it at the time, I'm sure, but was an appointment that had a huge impact. And the relationship that the two of you, the Conservative Prime Minister and the Socialist former provincial leader in Ontario, managed to develop over this issue. This is what Stephen Lewis talks about, and it's really quite something. All I can tell you, and actually I'm glad of this opportunity to tell you, is that from the earliest days of my time at the UN, the Prime Minister and I had a continuing run of phone calls, initiated by the PM when the focus was obsessively on South Africa, and he could not have been more genuine in his sense of outrage. In fact, as a fascinating footnote, I never discussed apartheid with my ostensible bosses in external affairs. From my vantage point, the South African file was the Brian Mulroney file. That's interesting to me on a lot of levels, but he makes a point of excluding the external, the foreign affairs people. And I think part of the reason for that was you were having as much trouble with the bureaucracy as you were having with some of your opponents around the negotiating table.
Yeah, it wasn't always a perfect fit. and we had some difficulties. I mentioned Joe Clark earlier. I'll do it again to tell you that on all of these major issues, we were on all fours together. And if we were able to maneuver the bureaucracy, not only in that, but in other things where they opposed the governments, I shouldn't say they opposed, they expressed, let me put it this way, on this file, the bureaucracy's enthusiasm was kind of under control. And so it got to the point, really, where I had to make the decision if we were going to follow through on my commitment to Tambo and Tutu and so on, originally in 1984, we were going to do that. I had to take control of the file myself. And as Lloyd Axworthy can tell you, that if there's a harmony in the thought between the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, no one's going to interfere. No one in the government is going to interfere. And I knew that Stephen Lewis was out there, hanging out there in New York, saying things and doing things with which a lot of them disagreed back in Ottawa. So that's why I made sure that he communicated with me and I with him to make certain that this file advanced, because we are now in 87, I think, and Mandela's still in jail. And nothing has happened. There's no promise of any progress beyond what we're doing. Now, we are at that point in time, Peter, we are making progress on these sanctions. They were up and down, you know. We had good days and bad with that. But we were making progress, and I was making progress in my own way for the following reason. The trick in something like this is to get it on the agenda. Like, you know, Justin is having the G7 down in La Malbaie. What's on the agenda is pretty darn important, and how you get it. He'll control that agenda. Now, through a fluke, in 1987, Canada hosted the G7, La Francophonie, and the Commonwealth. And guess who was the chairman? Your humble servant. Yeah. So guess who set the agenda? And so we were able to, and I would lobby them before, say, look, you can do, I'll put that on, we can get a statement out for you on that, but I want help on Mandela. I want help on South Africa. And all of a sudden, people who had been completely resistant, all of a sudden started to put some water in their wine. And we started to make some progress on that level. Because I knew that ultimately, what was going to impress the people in South Africa was not Brian Mulroney telling them whatever. It was going to be the impact of the shifting opinion of the G7 and elsewhere, weighing heavily on the incoming new administration, which had to come in South Africa, where the sanctions were nailing them into the ground. They were being paralyzed in all kinds of economic activity, from flights they couldn't fly anywhere, to soccer games that they couldn't participate in, to banking regulations that strung them up. So this was all part of a rather sophisticated international component, and that 1987 became vital because it allowed us to, Canada, to play that role.
Well, one of the reasons some say that it became vital and caused some movement was that you and Lewis put back in a speech that you were giving at the UN a line that your officials have pulled out.
That's right.
Didn't want you to say it.
That's right, yeah.
What was it?
Well, the line that was in the speech, and they had taken out, and Stephen and I were sitting in the room just off the General Assembly before I spoke to the United Nations. It was something to the effect that unless South Africa comes to its senses and ends this policy of apartheid in South Africa and the illegal imprisonment of Nelson Mandela, Canada is prepared to terminate our relationships with South Africa completely and absolutely. Now, for a G7 nation to say that for the first time, knowing that others, for example, the French, were right behind us, and that all of a sudden there was pressure. Teddy Kennedy and Paul Simon in the Senate were working with me because they headed the subcommittee on Africa. And as Gary knows, all of a sudden when things start to happen with senior members of Congress, so all of a sudden this pressure was building almost by itself. But that was a signal. And to the Commonwealth, to the members of the Commonwealth, which we're now, 50 countries now, I think. And for them to hear that, I mean, they went wild in the General Assembly. It was something that Stephen said that he had never seen anything like it before. And that was because I think that, to go back to what Tutu said, I think he was right. I think that this cause for Mandela and South Africa needed a series of champions. One of them was Canada. And we became a valuable champion for them because of our G7 status, our status in the Commonwealth. our status in la francophonie. In other words, we could deliver on commitments we made. And I think that was particularly helpful, at least in years after. Mandela used to refer to it all the time.
We've only got about we've only got about 10 or 15 minutes at the most, because you've got a plane to catch. So I want to move it to one of the things that this whole episode proved about this country as a middle power, and that its ability to use clout. Lloyd knows about this. Gary has witnessed some of this. But when you know, there are consequences to using clout, especially if you're the little guy at the table or the middle guy at the table. So how did you weigh that in these kind of discussions about, you know, you must have made a decision that day just off the General Assembly. I'm going to say this anyway.
Yeah.
You must have made the decision when you were confronting Thatcher, and you had real confrontations with her beyond the one that you've mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
And putting up your credibility against hers and your country's credibility against hers. How did you make that decision? What the risks in doing what you did?
Well, I've always felt that, and I go back to the Diefenbaker point, there's a little something in our Canadian citizenship which actually sets us apart a little bit. Every once in a while, the country insists that we do the right thing. And I took a position that the country supported because it was the right thing to do. The image of Nelson Mandela starving away in that cell. And if you've been to Cape Town and you look at Robbins Island, he could see the lights, the bright lights of Cape Town. They wouldn't let him see his children. They wouldn't let him see his wife. They used to pass on all kinds of rotten stories about what was going on to demoralize him. And so I felt that it was urgent that we try and get him out of there. And so I made the decision that irrespective of the consequences, I didn't go out of my way looking for trouble. I called President Reagan and I said, look, Ron, I know where you are in this, but you've got to understand where we are, and here's why we're there. And you don't have to get involved in this fight, but I've got to be involved. And from time to time, I may need your help, and I'm going to count on it. He said, Brian, look, I have my policy and my views, but I'll support you where I can. And I did the same with the others. Mitterrand came on side completely, and so on. Even Kohl, Helmut Kohl, who was dead set against a lot of this in the beginning of those G7 days in Bonn. They all kind of came along. But I felt it was right for Canada. I said to Margaret Thatcher in a very serious argument, I said, in Vancouver, I said, now, Margaret, everybody was there. And Stephen, I think, has spoken about this. I said, Margaret, you are opposed to sanctions where, 4 million whites are dominating 35 million blacks. What do you think you'd say if 4 million blacks were dominating 35 million whites? And she turned white. right on the spot. And I said to her, when she remonstrated with me privately after, I said, Margaret, you do what you want. I am not a member of your government. I am the head of a sovereign government. We are not going to do, you've got your followers in London. I know that. You've got the media with you and so on. But I'm telling you, Margaret, that I am going to place my country, Canada, on the right side of history. And I'll bet you $1 to a donut that 25 or 30 years from now, you're going to regret the position that you've taken. Well, when Mandela came out of jail, he was asked soon thereafter, which position? The position of Prime Minister Mulroney or the position of Prime Minister Thatcher did you endorse? He said, Mr. Mulroney, obviously. So that was simply the Canadian perspective, which I felt had to be heard. And this, because it spoke to a larger issue, Peter. It spoke to the whole concept of international tolerance, anti-discrimination, fairness, growth, prosperity, fairness among peoples. It was the whole ball of wax. It wasn't just a single shot. And I can tell you that when Mandela came out, I had Nicholas, who was then about 5 years old, to the second floor, 24 Sussex. And I said, I want you to watch, we're going to watch television, and I want you to watch this because a great hero is coming out. And Mandela walked out that afternoon with Winnie, and Nicholas was sitting on my lap on the second floor, and we watched it. The next morning, I get a call from the Prime Minister's switchboard. And the switchboard said, Prime Minister, there's a call here from somebody who says he's Nelson Mandela. I said, yeah, that's my friends in Baie-Comeau. Loaded in the tavern. And they're having fun with me. She said, well, I don't know, but he sounds an awful lot like the guy I heard on television last night. So Mandela, I say, okay, put him on. It's Mandela. And Mandela's message was fairly short and sweet. He said, you know, Prime Minister, I followed you, a young conservative Prime Minister, getting elected, and you made my case the priority of your government. I followed you as best I could with the BBC shortwave. So I just want to tell you that given what Canada has done for me and for my people, I want you to know that I will make, if you're interested, I will make my first speech as a free man to a free parliament in a free country, Canada. So I said, Mr. Mandela, would you like me to send a plane this afternoon? Or would tomorrow morning be okay? So this was the, but I should tell you, I mean, you talk about Mandela, obviously, great things about him, but one of was the fact that he had no vindictiveness and no malice. If he had come out of jail and said, these bastards put me in here, and by God, I'm going to fix them, there would have been a bloodbath right through Africa. And yet he was the gentleman, the principled man of politics that kept his country and Africa together and strong. But you know, he wasn't without a sense of humor, and it's not all serious. Mandela is out, and he's going around having, they have a convention and an election coming up, but most of all, it's the convention to get the new constitution and so on. So I'm in Zimbabwe. Joe and I are there, and we're having lunch with Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. And we had been helping, Canada had been helping Mandela financially for the things that he couldn't afford, obviously. So Mandela says, Brian, we need a little more money, you know, to organize the Constitutional Convention and all that stuff. I said, Nelson, look, we're broke. And if I give away any more taxpayers' money, I'm going to get lynched as soon as I get back to Canada. Well, he said, this will be the last time. You've been very good. You've been very kind. This is the last time I'll ask you. I said, well, all right, what are you talking about? And Mandela says, Brian, $10 million. I thought for a second. I said, okay, Nelson, I'm going to give you the 10 million. But, you know, the well is dry. That's it. He said, no, absolutely. He stands up as if he's going to give a speech to the United Nations General Assembly. And there's just Clark and I. And he says, Brian Mulroney, you are a great Prime Minister. Canada is a fabulous country. $10 million. Wonderful. Brian, could you make that in US dollars, please?
Okay, we have time for one last question, and I guess, I mean, we could sit here easily for another hour with questions on this subject, but let me try and put it in one last question. In terms of this whole episode, in terms of what the lesson is, I mean, the day will come when we're all long gone and forgotten. But historians will look back to this moment and they'll say, there was a lesson here for Canada. What was that lesson?
The lesson was when you are confronted with an international travesty, your citizenship in Canada is worthless unless you are ready to take up the cudgels and go to battle. You must fight these fights. There are certain, not too many, but there are certain fights that have to be fought, and there are certain fights where Canada, if I may say, alone is equipped morally and by our traditions and our history to lead. You know, leadership is not a popularity contest. You want to be popular? Do nothing. You want to be successful and remembered in history? Do big things. You know, you can't think of it as easy headlines in 10 days. But you must think of it as a better Canada in 10 years. And we become a better Canada by the leaders we elect doing, at least occasionally, the right thing at the right time in a manner that commands the admiration and attention of the world. And so people can say, that's what we thought about Canada. That's what we really believed about Canada for 150 years. And we're delighted to see them expressing this intense loyalty that they have in Canada to these values and these truths. And I think that if the government of Canada, my government or another government, is able to advance that cause, I think we've done the right thing, and we've burnished a little bit more the wonderful Canadian citizenship we all enjoy.
Do you think we still have the position in the world and the clout attached to it that can allow us to be that country?
Yes, I do. I think that the government is conducting itself in an honorable way, the federal government, as is the opposition in supporting them on some major initiatives.
I must have missed that.
Oh, did you? Then you weren't watching when Rona Ambrose supported free trade.
Yeah.
No, I think that it's look, as Gary can testify firsthand, anybody who thinks that a country like Canada or another, say, middle power can exercise great influence internationally without a relationship of trust with the President of the United States is kidding himself. I know you read about this stuff in in books and so on, but it ain't so. Now, I was privileged to work with people like Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton, and they admired Canada and cooperated with Canada as well, as did Obama as well. Now we've got ourselves a different kettle of fish. How do you like that for diplomacy?
Some kettle.
Some fish.
Some fish.
Yeah. But, you know, we don't control our agenda and they don't control theirs. There's an election coming up in Mexico on the 1st of July. Big time stuff. Do you want another Chavez on your southern border? I was invited to go down to the and the American election's coming up in November. Who knows what's going to happen there? And who knows what happens after that when the Americans speak? But I went down in their invitation to the United States Senate a few months ago to speak to them about international trade and NAFTA. And one of the things I said to the senators there, I testified for about 2 hours. And I said, you know, Canadians, I said, I've always felt that the United States of America was the greatest democratic republic that God ever placed on the face of this earth. And that Canadians are fortunate to have you on our southern border. And let me tell you that when Americans wake up every morning, they should get down on their bloody knees and thank the dear God above that Canada is their northern neighbor. And, you know, I've got to tell you, I'll tell you that was the reaction. Your reaction was the reaction of the senators. And the next day, who knows, you know, God acts in mysterious ways. The next day, 39 Republican senators signed a letter to President Trump saying you can massage NAFTA all you want. You can modernize it all you want, but you cannot tear it up, because if you do, you're going to have to deal with us. So, you know, my mother used to tell me, you know, Brian, always be grateful for small blessings. That was a small blessing, and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah. So just in wrapping up, you hinted, or you stated that Canada's hosting the G7 this week, later this week, in Quebec. And I wonder if, is this another you're on the wrong side of history moment that somebody could say to somebody else?
Yes, I think it is. I think what's happened is that down there is that, at least for the moment, the protectionist wing of the administration has captured the file on international trade. And that's what we're seeing. And the big question then becomes, and if I were there, I'd put it to the president, tell me, Mr. President, how do you negotiate a free trade agreement with a protectionist administration? And when you see the chaos going on between China and Mexico and Canada and Europe, I just got in from Paris yesterday. And I want to tell you, and I saw a lot of the European leaders. I mean, they make, you know, they're going wild. Angela Merkel made a speech in Hamburg the other day where she just tore a strip off of the American administration. This is not good or healthy for the alliance, and it's certainly not good or healthy for Canada and the United States. But I think that, you know, when Mr. Trudeau came to see me and asked me to help out in the negotiations and so on, and I even went to he asked me to go see his cabinet and talk to them about free trade negotiations. By the way, I should tell you, I go to the cabinet, first Conservative Prime Minister in history to go to a Liberal cabinet meeting, you know. and I go in, the cabinet, you know, the Canadian government's cheap as hell. The cabinet, my old cabinet room hasn't changed a bit. You know. And so I go around shaking hands with the ministers, most of whom I didn't know. And Mark Garneau was the Minister of Transport, and he was standing there. He said, Prime Minister, here is your the chair when you were Prime Minister. We got it here for you. So I said, thank you, Mark, and I sit down. And it's like a big oval room, you know, like this. And up against there is the back wall. And there is back wall were the two confidential note takers who were always there for cabinet meetings to take the confidential notes. And so I sat down and I looked up against the bare wall. And I said, hey, who took my picture down? And they're saying, not me, Prime Minister. It wasn't me. I said, don't get alarmed. It was never there anyway.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney.
That was great. That was great stuff. Thank you. Good for you. Yeah.